And now to speak about his life is Vivian Goose. Beginning in the late 50s, Vivian was a psychologist working with schizophrenic patients in a mental hospital. This is hard to read here with the, okay. In the early 60s, she was searching around town for professionals who were studying a nonverbal approach to mental illness. Vivian's husband, Henry Goose, was a highly respected psychologist and professor, and he handed her a flyer which announced the Tuesday evening seminars at Alexander Lowen's office. And this began a connection to Lowen and to bioenergetics that continues until today. She was a member of Al's executive committee for many years. And she is an international trainer who has taught widely in the US, in Canada, in Europe, and in Israel. So Vivian, while being a steady and grounding presence in the Institute, has also contributed significantly to other organizations in the field, such as the American Association for Psychotherapy and the United States Association for Body Psychotherapy. So let's welcome Vivian Goose.
Is this right? Can you hear me? Both of them? Is this right? Okay. I want to thank the committee for inviting me to do this talk today. I feel very honored to be here in this day, in this place, celebrating the life of Alexander Lowen in the Community Church of New York. It is here that he lectured almost annually between 1962 and 1975. And this is where I first became excited and very satisfied to listen to him. I don't remember whether it was in this particular room, but I do know that being here today sort of rounds out my experience with Alexander Lowen, and I'm sure the committee didn't know how significant this place was to me. Al Lowen's life spanned most of the 20th century, and he died just short of his 98th birthday toward the end of 2008. The part of his life that he became known for started when he met Wilhelm Reich in 1940, when he was about 30 years old, and Reich lectured at the New School for Social Research. The New School is just down the road a piece on 12th Street near 6th Avenue. And in 1940, the New School was a haven for European intellectuals who had escaped Hitler's Europe. It was a hotbed of new and interesting thinking. Reich's lectures here shook Lowen to his bones and set the tone for his entire career. After being Reich's patient for several years and then medical school, Al Lowen returned to New York in 1951 to start his practice. The decade of the 1950s was a very repressive time in this country. The fear of being radical, nonconformist, or being called a communist by Senator McCarthy hung like a dark cloud over the intellectual community of the United States. That's when the backup singers of the doo-wop groups all moved in the same way. That's when most of the teenagers in my generation, just a little bit after, wore saddle shoes. That's what I remember. Yet at the same time, all over the country, in isolated pockets, psychotherapists were experimenting, incubating new ideas and ways of doing therapy that flowered, I may say, erupted in the next decade, the 1960s. Al Lowen was a man of this time. He was not entirely alone. John Parakis and Bill Walling and he formed a support group for each other. And Al's important book, the most important book for me, The Physical Dynamics of Character Structure, was published in 1958. This is a more descriptive title than the same book reprinted later as Language of the Body. In the 1950s, I started working in the mental hospital. I was too young and inexperienced to know that one couldn't do psychotherapy with psychotics, so I jumped right in. I couldn't find books to help me or people to help me, so I started to do things like squeezing somebody's hand when I spoke to them so I could hold her attention a few seconds longer, things of that kind. But after a while, I got lonely and started taking workshops with various body workers all over town, looking for what I could learn that might be useful in my work that didn't depend on conversation alone. I took workshops with Charlotte Selver, Carola Spies. Those are the names that come to mind. In 1960 or 61, that fateful flyer came into my hand announcing the professional workshops in Alexander Lowen's office, where demonstrations would be made of psychotherapy. So I went, and not only did I see psychotherapy done, but they had a theory as well. So I stayed, and here I am. As I said, Al Lowen was a man of his time. His work jarred with mainstream inhibitions about sex and strong emotional expression. And his was a call for the development of mature sexuality and the fullness of healthy being, including love. At the same time that Reich, his mentor, was being called a quack and died in 1958. During the 60s, Al went out to speak to many groups, always embattled by hecklers and negative mainstream consultants. Then he'd go out and speak again, and again meet a wall of negativity. Then he'd go out and do it again, same thing, and again and again and again. Those of us who watched felt that it took heroic dedication and energy in the service of the right as he experienced his mission. The mission, of course, was to alleviate the suffering of human beings. Al Lowen was a hero. Driven by passion, he entered the fray willingly and thrived on battles that would have laid low another kind of person, certainly a kind of person like myself. Maybe he knew, and maybe he didn't even know, how much courage it took to do what he did. Once I happened to be in the waiting room he shared with John Parakis on a morning after one of these embattled lecture events. He came out of his room to get something from the secretary. His whole body looked taller and fuller than I remembered. He looked alive, aglow, emanating a kind of radiance I had never seen before. And I assumed it was related to his battle of the night before. Al Lowen was a warrior. A warrior fights fiercely for what he believes, and at his best, fights for the help, protection, and healing of those he cares about. He said he was not a revolutionary the way Reich was, but in a way he was, in his own way, of course. He was not afraid to be different, and unlike Reich, his focus was not to change society, but to stay within the arena of character analysis and physical work to recover the aliveness and dignity of the individual. This was his mission. What he said about Reich could easily be said of him as well. He said, so much of the power of Reich's therapy was in the strength of his personality and the strength of his being. Reich was brilliant and knew his ideas were right. Warriors both. Determined and persevering, Al let nothing prevent him from carrying out his inner-directed task. If he felt fear, either from McCarthyism in the 1950s or the more recent restrictive climate for psychotherapy professionals, I have no evidence of it. In any case, it wouldn't have stopped him. He knew his cause was just. From what I've said, one might think life was mostly pressure, but not so. He could relax. At the end of the day, he loved to sit around and tell stories with whoever joined him. Following in his wake, I took courage from his battles, and my battles were easier because of him. For this, I am deeply, deeply grateful. In later years, when he felt that some of his followers were not doing bioenergetic analysis the way he wanted them to, he forgot something he told me early on, when he was a confident, robust man in his early 50s. I had complained to him that I couldn't do something in therapy the way he did it. And his reply was, bioenergetics moves through each person's body in a unique way, so of course, your way of doing therapy won't be like mine. I've held on to this statement through the years. No matter what he said later, or how he tried to control the uncontrollable, the way other therapists get to use bioenergetics. I have felt secure in the knowledge that whatever moves through my body is bioenergetic and correct for me. In 1971, the formal training program was started. It was at the end of a workshop, and I was sitting next to Al when he said, "Come with me." I followed him into the next room where there were a group of people already assembled, and there I learned that we were going to teach in a formal program. It took a while before I stopped thinking that the reason I was included in this group was because I had been sitting next to him, and that if I had been sitting somewhere else, I would not have been called. I had never been his patient, and I couldn't tell how he felt about me, and was always surprised when he invited me in. As more and more people became involved in bioenergetics through the training programs, Al became uneasy, since he only completely trusted what he could touch. As a carryover from the Reichian time, he had little faith in organizations of any kind. So his relationship to the organized training programs remained uneasy, except where he was in direct contact with some group in a workshop where he could touch people directly. 1972-73 was a very difficult year for Al and the people around him. The inner group, which was composed of Jack McIntyre, John Bellis, Bob Lewis, Bob Zimmerman, Carl Kirsch, Al himself, John Parakis, and myself. That was the year John Parakis started to push for adding a spiritual dimension to the bioenergetic work. Al was opposed to moving in any direction away from the physical body. The wrangling took upwards of a year before John left the Bioenergetic Institute and formed what he then called Core Energetics. Al was deeply hurt and angry at the defection. As a warrior, he was so convinced of the rightness of his own position that he became infuriated whenever he was challenged, and here it was his long-term partner who challenged him. It took 20 years before he allowed a rapprochement to take place. Yet isn't this in the nature of the warrior, to be so goal-directed, determined, persevering, totally convinced that he was right? Through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, bioenergetics spread from the United States to Europe and then to South America. And by the middle of the 90s, the warrior had started to feel ungrounded in his life, so it was time to withdraw from the fray, to rest and recover his strength. So he resigned as director of the IIBA at age 86, but continued his practice and to give workshops. In the course of things, I was disappointed that he disregarded women's issues, but I was used to that. I come from a generation of women who, if we wanted something, we went to where it was, and in a perhaps non-challenging or non-threatening way, absorbed what we wanted and threw away the rest, and that's what I did. One time, as Al was strutting up and down, holding forth to this audience of 7 people, he looked as if he was in a movie version of a 19th century surgical arena, where the big professor dispenses knowledge and wisdom to all the lesser doctors and medical students. As he strode up and down, he intoned, "Gentlemen," and continued with his talk. John Bellis made a startled movement and quickly glanced at me. I, of course, didn't move a muscle. I had learned not to respond to disregard of that kind. And I shall always cherish the memory of John Bellis for that involuntary movement. On the other hand, Al was always respectful of me on the personal level, and he was respectful of all the women patients whom I have spoken with who worked with him. What I have appreciated most about Al Lowen was the clarity of his thinking, the carefulness of his boundaries, his courage in pursuing his mission, his gracefulness on the dance floor, and his unwillingness to engage in disputes and controversy about other systems of therapy. He wouldn't waste his time on useless battles. On one program, billed as a debate between him and Albert Ellis, each man used his time to expound his own view, never attacking the other's position, simply ignoring it. Very gentlemanly, I thought. 2 driven men with no rancor between them. I admired the physicalness in his spirituality. While he responded with awe at the vastness of nature and the mystery of the life force, he also insisted that grace consisted of resilience and harmony in the form and movement of the body, and, quote, an attitude of graciousness to all of God's creatures, unquote, as he says in his autobiography. He never achieved as much of the softness he aspired to as part of his concept of grace, and he never achieved the grand influence in the medical community that he originally fancied. Yet he succeeded in living his life according to his principles. His main contribution lay in his direct work with the body. His teachings gave legitimacy to the field of body psychotherapy. And he gave people like me a place to be, where I could feel at home as a therapist who uses her hands and her breath as tools. To almost the end of his life, Al kept his own tools honed, thinking up new ways of working energetically. Like the samurai of old, whose first duty was to keep their swords sharpened. In conclusion, what can we say of Al Lowen? That he fulfilled his nature and lived his life with honor and integrity, and left us with some clues about how we might fulfill ours. Hopefully, with a deeper, though imperfect, understanding of how to realize our lives, along whatever paths we take from the road he carved out for us. I offer this with a profound sense of gratitude and love.